Alright, welcome class to another episode of CIS1199. Today we're going to be talking about level design from our book's chapter 7. Let's get right into it. Excuse me. The two main types of level design that we're going to be focusing on are distinct and non-distinct. We're going to be going back and forth between these a lot in the later slides. You can imagine the distinct level design is the more traditional levels like platformers and puzzle games and that, where the levels are discrete, they're obvious that those are levels, and then the non-distinct ones are basically any open world games. I have Zelda listed as a hybrid in there because it's kind of an open world game. The original Zelda has distinct levels in the underworld, and the overworld is non-distinct. And there are some other games that are like that as well. Moving on to objectives in a game, you need to give the player a heads up, tell them somehow what the objectives are. Don't just assume that they know everything. This was in a previous example from some weeks ago. You can't assume that players know information that you haven't told them. So you need to tell them what the objectives are ahead of time. Some games will have an intro scene like GoldenEye before the mission starts. The game will show the player what the mission is, what the objectives are, and which, if any, are the secondary objectives. Secondary objectives are those that are not required to beat the level, to pass the level, but they do give some sort of bonus to the player, whether that bonus is maybe something is unlocked or they're just going to get loot. Whatever the case is, that's what the secondary objectives are for. Another thing about objectives is, do your levels pretty much all have the same objective, similar to like a Mario game where it's just walk to the right and get to the end, or are your levels different, whether that's an open world game, or if it's like my example here, GoldenEye, where sometimes the objectives are to jump off a dam, sometimes it's to protect Natalia, sometimes you have to defeat all the enemies. Every level has a different set of objectives. The similarities being that you're going to have the mission intro and it's going to list the objectives every time, and there are some repeating objectives, but not every level is going to be the same. The similarity is in the way that they're presented, and you get the players accustomed to having a few different things that it can do, and then they become second nature to the players. Game level flow. How do the levels flow into each other? How do you prevent the players from accessing later content too early? Or how do you keep players from accessing stale content once they've passed it, if you choose to do so? Not every game chooses to do so, but some games do. Certainly there are lots of games, Mario games for example, not all of them, but some of them, when you pass a level, you're done with that level, you can never go back. Even some longer RPG games like Dragon Age Origins, every level is a one-off. It's very scripted and linear game. You have a couple of choices here and there, but you can only do each level once, and you can't go back. There's no farming. There's no going back to easy places to gather loot, to pick up items that you missed. That is a choice that you need to make fairly early on in your level design. And before you even really design any levels, you need to know whether or not players are going to come back. Some games you want them to come back. In a Dark Souls type game, or especially in a Castlevania type game, actually. The players are going to go through an area. There's some room in there that has a really high ledge that they can't reach until much, much later on when they finally get the double jump upgrade. And then they go back to this early on room and they double jump and they get up onto the ledge and they reach maybe it's just a one room with a treasure, or maybe it unlocks a whole area that's new to them. These are ways to get the players to come back and explore areas they haven't been before. So you have to make those choices very, very early on, whether or not players can go to levels more than once, whether you want them to go on there a la like Castlevania, or if you don't want them to go in there at all, or if you just want to have it open to them for farming or for picking up loot that they missed the first time around. These are all choices you have to make pretty early on. And then the other one that we didn't talk about too much is how do you prevent players from accessing late stage content too early. An old example that I like to mention is early Final Fantasy. I believe the first Final Fantasy had a fair number of places where you could walk either across a bridge or to the next area. You could walk over there unimpeded, but once you got there, the enemies were so difficult that either the player was just wiped or they retreated after one battle and they didn't go back there until they leveled up or got some better equipment or whatever the case is, but they just weren't ready yet. So we're going to call that a soft wall to prevent the players from flowing between levels, as opposed to a hard wall like a Castlevania or a Dark Souls, where you have to flip switches and ring bells and access power-ups that give you double jumps and things of that nature. Or Mario type game where you just can't get to level 4 until you beat level 3. Or there are some games where you have to beat a certain percentage of the levels before in order to get another level. So Super Mario 64, in order to unlock the next area, you have to achieve a certain number of stars, and you can get those stars from any of the previously accessed areas. So if you need one more star and you have 5 available levels, you can beat either any of them that you wanted to, get that star, and then unlock the next area. So you're not forced to play a particular level that you don't like until very late in the game when you're trying to get all the way to the end. Okay. Level duration. How long should a single level be? The golden rule, of course, is that a level should be however long you have predetermined that will be a single session. So you should be able to play one level, plenty enough time in one level in one play session. So if you have designed your game around casual mobile players, they're going to play 10 minutes or so, maybe even less sometimes, maybe a little bit more, but we'll say around 10 minutes in a single session. And if you make levels that are longer than that, or even close to being longer than that, you got to give them some way to save their progress and come back later. Otherwise, they're going to get annoyed with the fact that they have to play longer than they wanted to in order to beat a level, and they're not going to beat all the levels. They're going to, oh, I'm so close to the end, and I'm out of time. I got to go do whatever. I don't want to play this for too long all at once. Whatever the case is, and then they're not going to play their game very much, which is what you want them to do. You want them to play your game. So your levels should be, ideally they should be around the same amount of time. I know with RPGs it gets to be pretty different, but RPGs can save the progress whenever you want. So save progress means that you don't have to have levels that are all the same duration. And then my example here on the right, you might be noticing that the shorter levels versus the longer levels, you kind of see a trend where platformers and the like start having shorter levels, and RPGs and that have a lot of longer levels. That doesn't mean RPGs can't have short levels and platformers can't have long levels, but the majority of them are going to have one over the other. And that kind of goes into a little bit of the play style, a little bit of some of the other things that we mentioned from the other week, with the story elements, which I know I have another slide in here that mentions it with the rising action and the climax and that. If your levels are kind of all over the place, then your story arc is going to be too hot and cold in there, and it's going to be a little bit difficult for some of your players. But moving on to the availability of a given level. Do you want to present all the levels right up front to the beginning to the character, or do you want to have some sort of progression? And there's a lot of options in between. So take for instance Skyrim. Player begins, once they pass the tutorial area, they're pretty much free to roam wherever they want. There's very few places that are barred off from them from in the beginning, and those are specific main quest areas that they can't go into. Otherwise, they can go pretty much anywhere, whenever they want to, so long as they can actually play that area and survive. And then the opposite is some of the older, of course, the platform style games where you have to play each level one at a time in progression, of course. The very next step from that is like Super Mario 3 and then a Super Mario 64, where in Super Mario 3 they go to World 1 and there's the map laid out and they can navigate the map and they can skip some of the levels if they wanted to. Super Mario 64 is this giant mansion with levels and worlds all over the place, and the doors unlock when you achieve a certain number of stars, and it doesn't matter what level you beat in order to get those stars, so the player is free to make a lot of decisions as to what levels are too hard for them, what levels are too hard at the moment anyway, what levels they need more practice on, what levels are easy and they're going to knock those out really quickly. It also kind of goes into the duration as well. If some of those levels are harder and would take longer versus some that are easier, then the player is offered a little bit of choice between their play duration as well. Even though there's not a save in Super Mario 64 in the middle of the level, there's a bit of choice in there. And then you have somewhat of a hybrid as well, is a Dark Souls type game where players are free to roam and explore wherever they want to, but there are some boundaries, like we talked about already with switches and bells and that, and things that have to be unlocked. Dark Souls kind of goes the other way around a little bit, where instead of limiting players to go back to previous levels, in Dark Souls, once you reach a more advanced level, then usually there's some sort of secret path, or not really a secret path, but some sort of blocked path that's an easy shortcut back that you open up, and now it becomes a shortcut to that place. And later on, and then there's also transportation between bonfires later on as well, or even right away in the case of Dark Souls 2 and 3. But a lot of different options for what to do with the availability of the levels, and you have to kind of make that choice pretty early on as well too, because it does affect the just the nature of how you're building your levels. If they're going to be available all the time, one of the ways that Skyrim does that, I know at least a couple of options in the Bleak Falls Barrow mission that you get kind of really early on. If you access that, you can go through, before you even get the mission, you can go through and clear that whole dungeon and get all the loot. And then when you come out and you get the mission, the guy gives it to you, and then you're like, oh, you mean this thing that I already picked up? And he's like, oh, wow, you're cool. So that's one option, and they have to account for that. They scripted that ahead of time. Obviously, they recorded the audio and wrote everything down and did all that ahead of time. But then they have other options where there's a mission from the companions to go into this cave and get the heads of these harpy-like creatures. But if you had gone in there previously, it's just kind of a regular cave with the monsters in there, and you can go in there and you can loot it. And then when you get the mission, it becomes repopulated with this new cast of characters. So they've gone both ways in that. You have access the whole time, and in one case you can achieve the mission early, and in the other case the mission is time specific and they override it when it becomes active. That's a choice you have to make during the process of that level design as well, not quite as early on. That's specific to each level. Okay, the relationship between all your levels, how are they related? Do they feel like they're connected to each other? So Skyrim is going to still be a popular example again. Everything in Skyrim takes place in one land mass region, right? And it takes place in Skyrim. You do have a north and a south and east and west in that, and there's some different environmental stuff. There's a frozen area and a fall area in that. But in between all of those, you know it's the same place and feels similar. It kind of just feels like you're experiencing different weather, except that the north area is going to always be frozen and the south area is going to always be thawed out. But they match with each other. And there's the same plants all over the place, the same type of caves everywhere, the same people pretty much everywhere, except the same people pretty much everywhere. Different towns and that, but you know, all the same stuff. It all matches pretty well with each other. And then you have another example where probably all the Super Marios, you go to a world, and that world has a lot of similarities to itself. Maybe it's the desert world, or the water world, or the giant world, or the mini world, or the pipe world. The pipe world is filled with all kinds of pipes everywhere. And those things kind of match each other, and there's however many levels inside of that world, and it's just they broke it apart into different kind of subcategories, and then kept them all tightly ingrained to each other. That's really cool. Players are gonna get an affinity for that. They're gonna like that. They're gonna go, oh, you know, the big world is my favorite because it's just so cool, or whatever the case is. And players are gonna like that. They're gonna get a feeling of this whole area right here is uniform. This whole area over here is uniform. It's pretty good. And then another step away from that is something like a Contra, where every single level is totally different. Every single level is not really connected. The first level to the second level are connected in that when you get to the end of the first level, it's the door to the second level. But then they changed the perspective. It was a side scroller horizontally. Now it's a faux 3D vertical scroller. The enemies changed a little bit. Some of them have changed. A lot of the mechanics of it totally changed from level 1 to level 2. Then level 3 goes back to a side scroller, but now it scrolls vertically, so there's a lot of jumping. So they're totally different. There's even an alien level later on. There's a winter level, and they designed them all to be distinct, totally different levels, very much like a lot of racing games might have completely different levels as well. They all race, Contra they all jump and shoot, but the aesthetics of it, the scene, all that is entirely different. And then in a game like Contra, you'll have a whole different group of enemies. They have some similar ones that are in throughout the whole game, mostly throughout the whole game, but then each level will have its unique set of enemies that you encounter in that level. And then another way, the last example here is like a Lego Star Wars game where it has the world set up to match the story for each of the 6 movies at the time. I know there's more now, but for each of the 6 movies at the time. And then about every third or so level inside of there was a flying or a driving level that was just different from all the other ones. They didn't put all the flying levels together. They broke them apart, so there's one in every other section. So that one's very similar to a Super Mario type game with the worlds, except Super Mario takes all the desert levels and puts them in the desert. And Lego Star Wars says, we're going to take one driving level and put it in every other category. So they broke it apart totally differently. It makes sense for Lego Star Wars, and it makes sense for Mario, obviously. Just when you think about it a little bit more, the Lego Star Wars, if they put all the flying levels in one place, that wouldn't make a lot of sense because there's not all flying in one movie. So they had to put a little bit in each film, and that's how they broke it apart to go with the films. Mario doesn't have, there is a Mario movie, but Mario doesn't follow the movie, and so the worlds are all broken apart as they should be. And that's a decision for you to make on your game. The level progression from level to level, I mentioned the story arc earlier in another slide where the action rises and then the action goes back down again, and then the action rises, and that usually happens 2 or 3 times before it gets to the climax, which is the highest rise of action in there. The difficulty progression in the game should be kind of like the story arc, and it should quickly, when you get to the end, it's the end. But instead of being spiky like the story arc where it brings you up in excitement and then way back down again, and brings you up in excitement and way back down again, in the difficulty and level progression should be much more linear where you're going horizontal at the same difficulty for a while, and then there's a spike in difficulty either when you get to the next level or when you get to the next group of levels, there's a spike in difficulty. And how you communicate that information to the player is particularly important, whether it's at a level break in between levels, or like a Dark Souls fog wall. You put something in there to cue the player to say, hey, there's a more difficult part coming up. Maybe you put a save point right in front of a door to let the player know that if they go through that door, they might get their butt kicked. Or the player unlocks this new skill, which is cool for them. You make them, for a moment, they think, wow, everything that I've done up until now is going to be easy because I have this new skill. But then they're going to be required to use that new skill going forward. So everything after this is now harder. And ideally, there's some kind of balance in there, right? You can also have scripted events where you just flat out tell the player, hey, the tutorial's over and now comes the hard part, or hey, we're traveling to this other land and all the enemies are resistant to fire, so I hope you're still not using fire weapons anymore, whereas maybe they were only offered fire weapons before, so now it's going to be really difficult. They're totally kind of gimped from here. They're set at a difficulty, they have to start their weapon progression over again. Whatever the case is, it's just a great, have to make sure to communicate that information to the player. And then I have a note as well between games that have a straight linear progression or a non-linear progression. So like a Super Mario 64, where it's kind of a hybrid. It's non-linear. They collect their stars, and if they have this number of stars, they can unlock the next number of world. So we're giving them the choice of which levels to play, and they can pick based on based on their skill set, their time involved, whether or not they like this particular level because it's an ice level or a desert level or whatever the case is, whatever they make their choice on. Or if it's a Dark Souls type game, they're going to make their choice based on what type of weapon, their playstyle they prefer, whether they're going to go for the gargoyles first or Quelaag first to ring one of the two bells. The choice is up to the player. That doesn't fit every type of game, but it is something to plan for if you are putting it in yours. If you have any kind of non-linear options in there, the players are going to make choices, not necessarily the ones that you thought of when you were playing, or when you were thinking about it. Players are going to make all different types of choices, and you should make the progression kind of make sense if they make choices different than what you originally had in mind, or if you don't want the players to go that way, then make the progression kind of prohibit them from wanting to go that way, make it prohibitively difficult if you don't want it to go a certain way, or make it at least the same difficulty as the other way. If you want to give the players the choice, then try and level out the difficulty. Maybe one is a stealth option and one is a more active option. They're equally as difficult in their own right, but one's going to be harder or easier for any given player. So it doesn't have to be balanced perfectly. It just has to be, try your best to make sure that if you're offering two options, one of them is not clearly easier than the other one, or else nobody is hardly ever going to take the more difficult option unless it has some other kind of payoff, which you could also provide. Okay, game time. There is a lot of different ways that time takes place in games. I'll start with the most likely the rarest one is authentic time. Authentic time is when it's daytime in real life, it's daytime in the game. If it's nighttime in real life, it's nighttime in the game. This happens very rarely. It may be something more of a visual change. It may not change the actual gameplay. There are very few games that do that, though. The book does mention one or two of them. What is much more common for authentic gaming, especially with mobile games these days, is they have holiday events. They have a Christmas event, a New Year's event, a Chinese New Year event, a Halloween event, a Valentine's Day event. Depending on what country of origin the game is from, they may or may not have like a 4th of July event or something, or they may have a May Day event or whatnot. It really depends on the country of origin, how popular that event is to the developers. But holiday events are today's very common authentic time variant. Next, we've got limited time. The limited time is not necessarily that you have 5 minutes to beat this level. That's not exactly what I'm talking about there. The limited time is that things in the game are limited based on time. So in Skyrim, classic example is that all the shopkeepers they go to bed at whatever time in the night they go to sleep. You can't buy from them unless you break into their house and wake them up and buy from them then, but their doors are locked. So those things are limited. They're trying to immerse the player into the game. They're creating the night, the day. There are a number of missions that they have that you want to sneak around for, and they want to provide an opportunity for the players to steal, because a lot of players want to steal in the game, and so they have nighttime. So they're creating a handful of different things going around with that in Skyrim, where with the night and the day. In Minecraft, the monsters come out at night, and it's relatively safe in the daytime for you to be outside. These are the things that are limited in time, so gameplay things that are limited by the game time. And then something that often comes into play with that limited time is the variable time, where classically nighttime will be very much shorter than daytime. In some games, the night and the day, really the only difference is literally just the way the sky looks, and maybe the nighttime lasts a few minutes and the daytime lasts an hour. In Final Fantasy 15, it's similar to that. The nighttime is very short when compared to the daytime. Oftentimes, games will allow the player characters to sleep for the nighttime. So, Final Fantasy 15, Minecraft, you can sleep for the night, and then when the player sleeps, the time, if it's 10 minutes at night and you put your character to sleep, you don't wait 10 minutes. It happens instantly. It's morning time, and you get up and you go out, and the monsters are gone, hopefully. And that's the variable time. The time does change for the sleeping, and in some cases also for the nighttime. Adjustable time periods. These are pretty popular in sports games. If any of you are playing modern sports games, I've not played any in some years, but it was very common to change the length of time that a game period would be. So if you're playing ch0799, you can play 10, 20, and 30-minute periods. This lets the players themselves adjust the duration of the game. We'll go back to the duration slide. The players get to pick their own play session time by picking the length of the period. They can have a more realistic game if they want to battle their buddy, couch co-op, for an hour or more. They can put the half-an-hour periods or the 20-minute periods. Or if they want to do a quick one, they can do even a 5 or a 10-minute period. And then they can play more short games in the same amount of time they could play one long game. And they can choose that for whatever reason they want to choose that for. It doesn't matter. Once you give them the option to do so, now the choice becomes theirs. And by and large, they will appreciate that. They'll like the game more, that they're not locked into only one time frame. Some racing games do this as well. You can't really pick the length of the period in a race, but you can pick the number of laps. So if it's a NASCAR game and you're racing the Daytona 500, maybe you give them the option to do 4, 3, 2, or 100 laps or less. So they're doing the track. They want to play the game, but they don't want to be there all the live long day. They want to do a much shorter version, so you give them less options. But you can also give them the full 500 laps if you wanted to too. Some players are going to do that. They're going to really enjoy it, and they're going to probably lap the heck out of the computer players if they're not programmed to be some sort of catch up or something, right? And then last, I have altered time. Altered time may be one of my favorite, coolest options on here. I'm going to reference the Max Payne's bullet time, where gameplay is pretty normal. Time is kind of irrelevant for most of the game. There's not really an in-game time that matters at all. I don't even remember if there is one at all. but the power up that the player has is bullet time. They have their bullet time meter, and whenever they get into a dangerous situation, they turn on bullet time, and the player becomes very much faster than all of the enemies. Um, Similar to the Matrix or whatnot. So you're altering time, you're slowing down all the other characters, and you're leaving the player. Of course, the player is still at the same time because you can't alter the fabric of time for the human playing it. You can only slow down what's in the game. Um, that's a very cool feature. If you have a cool idea of how to do this with two players simultaneously, because you can't alter the time of, they can't alter the fabric of time for the two players. So if one player engages it, how is it going to affect the other player and vice versa? Does the other player just have a slower response? Does it really slow down their character? Do they both just get bullet time? Maybe they're on a team, or maybe the bullet time is just an environmental thing or something. That would be an interesting game mechanic to incorporate as multiplayer bullet time. That would be pretty fun. All right. That's yours. Um, the physical space in your game. Okay. So if you're playing like a tabletop or a puzzle game, the physical space is the 2D space of the puzzle. The players are not navigating it. They're not walking around. They're not doing any of that. If it's an actual tabletop game, the physical space may be the area that you lay out the cards. There are games that have a fold-out thing, and the cards have to be laid out. So again, 2D. There's not too many 3D tabletop games. Jenga, that is one of them. There are a few, but by and large, they're 2D or 0D. They're not really physically laid out. And the rest of them are all going to be 3D games. They're going to have some sort of map in there. They're going to have terrain and materials. Hopefully, when you're designing your levels, you make your terrain and your materials match whatever level they're supposed to be in. So if you're making the desert world at Mario, you have desert terrain and materials. You have cactuses and those things that blow by, you know what I'm talking about. And you have sand and bright sun, and maybe it's an old west desert, and there's some folks in the back riding horses or something, or maybe it's an African desert and there's some camels. All those things need to match the setting of the game itself and the setting of the world that you're in. So if you've broken your game levels apart into worlds, Mario style, then you just need to make sure that your groups or your levels have cohesiveness between the groups that you've set. Not necessarily that they all match each other, although there should be a lot of things that do match each other. Of course, if you're playing a Mario game, Mario is always the same. The sizes of the bricks are always the same, unless you go to the giant world, and so on and so forth. So the materials, and the terrain are matching the world that you have defined for your level. The lighting goes right in there. The lighting should match. If it's a scary game, it's probably dark. If it's a fun game, it's probably well lit. If you mix those two up, you end up with, I'm not sure what you end up with, right? A well lit scary game is less scary, and a dark fun game is less fun. So you want to get your lighting correct. You want to get your lighting to be a good balance of allowing the player to navigate that space, creating the right amount of tension that you want to make with that navigation. Maybe that amount is 0, maybe that's a lot. That would depend on your game, what the story is. If you're going to Blight Town in Dark Souls, it's pretty dark, but you can still see a fair distance in there. If you're going, if you're in the North Winter in Skyrim, it's pretty bright, and you can't see that far because maybe a snowstorm came in your little area, and you can only see one hill away because of the fog of snow or whatnot, which leads me right into the realism and style. That is entirely dependent on the world that your game has created. If it's realistic or not realistic, it's cartoony, whatever. It's entirely dependent on your game. But how the player sees it and interacts in there, the world in the game and the HUD and the menus and the icons and the materials that are in there, they should all be of one cohesive theme and style. And make sure that that is the same all the way around. The next three things on here, perspective, boundaries, and scale, they do have their own slide. And I want to note that we've talked about boundaries a little bit, but terrain materials can be part of the boundaries. Let's have a look at perspectives are next. Okay. Well, we all know first person and third person perspective. We don't really need to learn about that again. Some of these, we probably know all these other ones as well. But I want to give a proper name. The omnipresent or God view, which is fairly common in real-time strategy games, is not the same as a top-down. Generically, we may call it a top-down view because you're looking down from up top, but the omnipresent view is a much broader scale. Make the comparison between Zelda being a top-down view, and you're looking at one room, you're looking at your character walking around, you can see more than enough to make your actions. You can see all the enemies that are within your radius of attack, or you're within theirs, but that's all you can see. That's all you need to see at any given time. In an RTS game, the omnipresent view is zoomed back an order of magnitude from that. You can see many units. You can see a lot of area. You can there may be 100 units on the screen at any given time. Some of them let you zoom in and out a little bit so that you can focus more on one little area, because we are humans and our attention span is only so big. And sometimes we're not looking at entire fields of battle all at once. We need to micromanage them a little bit. But the omnipresent view is inherently much bigger than the top-down view. The next is the isometric, which for either one of those cases can be applied. It's just it's either the omnipresent or the top-down view, skewed off usually about 30 degrees or so to one angle, tipped back a little bit so that you can give a more 3D view. In the older games, they were probably still drawn in 2D, but they were drawn to look like they were in 3D. In the newer games, they're probably all going to be 3D. Some of the games in between those two were actually 2.5D, where they were 2D drawings drawn in a 3D plane layered over each other so that you could see the overlapping in that, and they were still forced perspective to the isometric view. The forced perspective is when you draw something in such a way that you're forcing it to look like it's of a slightly different perspective than it actually is. So in Zelda, one of the forced perspective attributes in there is the original Zelda. It's a top-down view. You're looking into a room. All the characters are actually sideways. You're not looking at the top of their heads. You're looking at them sideways. You're seeing, if there's a block in the middle of the room, you're seeing all four sides of it somehow. You're seeing the edge of the north, south, east, and west. You're seeing the edge of the walls in there as if you were kind of seeing from inside a little bit. So they're forcing your perspective to be different than it would be if you were actually in the spot that you feel like you're in. So that's the forced perspective. And then the last one that I want to mention a little bit is the side-scrolling, which is the traditional platform side-scrolling type of view or perspective. It does not have to scroll only to one side. It can scroll up, down, left, right, diagonal. It's you're to the side of the character and the screen scrolls. That's what it is. There can even be a top-down side scroller. Those are pretty popular with all the bullets flying all over the place. Okay, those are technically still side scrollers. They could auto scroll, or they don't specifically have to auto scroll to still have the name. All right, next is boundaries. We're almost at the end now. So we've talked about boundaries a few different times in accessibility. How are the players going to access different levels? Sometimes it's going to be a boundary. We talked about boundaries in the flow between levels. Sometimes the thing that stops players from progressing from one level to another level is a boundary. And what can those boundaries be? So I have some examples here. The boundary can be an island. This is the world boundary. Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, you play the entire game on an island area, and the player can navigate anywhere they want to on there, but the game exists on an island. There's a bit of water around. You're not going off the island. That's the entire game world. Instead of putting mountains on one side like Skyrim did, or the same developers did in Skyrim, they put mountains on one side and ocean on the other side. Open fields can also be used. You can put an invisible wall in the middle of a huge field, and if a player walks halfway through a totally empty field and hits an invisible wall, it's going to be only a small surprise to them. They're not going to be that upset when they can't go any farther. They might feel slightly foolish, but they'll feel like, oh, I accomplished something. I figured out where the border is, and they'll just know about that. Smaller borders are, you can have a fog of war, even in a map view, or like a fog wall. You can even do something as creative as road construction. If your game takes place in a city, maybe it only takes place in a certain area in the city, and you can just cordon off a road with some cones and a little horse with a light on it, and don't let the player cross that area. It looks pretty cool. They can see the construction on there. They know that it's a thing that in reality, if I came up on a construction area, I should not be crossing into it. So you can bring the real world information into the game, and when they get to the road construction and they can't cross it, it makes perfect sense to the player, and then they continue on in the other direction and they follow the mission. And then the last one, I want to remind again about soft walls, where you simply change the difficulty of the creatures, or you just change the difficulty of the area, in effect making a boundary that the player has now, they feel like they've focused it on themselves to some extent, because they're like, oh, I'm not ready for this area yet. I need to level up my character, or I need to find some better equipment or get some power-ups or something before I can get to this new area. So then the limit is imposed. For some challenge runners, they may try to break that limit. For the average player, they're going to go, oh, okay, I just need to work a little bit longer in my area, and then I'll try that later. So those are some things with boundaries. Specifically, my last note that I have here is about game engine type of stuffs. What are you going to do with 3D boundaries built into the game? So if you have an area with a window, what kind of options do you have? If you take like a Skyrim or a Fallout 3 type example, there are no windows. Right? They may show windows, but when you're inside, you can't see out, and when you're outside, you can't see in. They're two different levels. The inside and the outside are completely different, and they don't interact with each other, not directly. An opposite end of that is more like Borderlands, or just like on the outside of Fallout and Skyrim, where everything is just part of the same map. There's no inside and outside at the time, and so if you can see it, you can interact with it, you can shoot it, whatever the case is. So that's going to be more along the lines of choosing a game engine or choosing how to use a game engine. Just because a game engine lets you have, basically those are warps when you go through a door and you end up on the inside versus the outside, you're just warping to some other level. And you don't necessarily have to do that. You can have much larger areas. You don't have to have the inside being inside and the outside being the outside. You can just make everything outside, and when a person leaves a cordoned off area, now they're transported to the next area. So you can have your levels be different, or you can go the same route that they used in Fallout and Skyrim. That's a choice that kind of should be made by the gameplay style that you've chosen. And last slide, the scale of different things in your game is very important, right? Ideally, we should be keeping things in scale groups. So things like keys and power-ups and that, they should be, depending on your game, if you're trying to be realistic in that, like Skyrim keys are the size of keys, give or take, they're pretty close. But if you want people to be able to see them from farther away, then keys and power-ups and that should be larger than they are in reality. Things like bullets are another group of sizes. If it's if it's a FPS, the bullets might not actually exist because they're speed of light, point target type of things. They may not actually exist. They just mathematically calculate it out. Or if it's more like a Contra type of game, the bullets in that are bigger than the player's head and they're traveling relatively slowly across the screen. So the bullets are scaled, and it needs to be scaled in one direction for that game. For Contra, it needs to be larger. For an FPS, it needs to be like single point in space, moving at light speed, or maybe a trajectory and a time is calculated. But still, the bullet doesn't necessarily have to actually even exist because it's moving faster than humans can see anyway. And then you can also scale other things as well. So regular enemies generally are the same scale as the person, or what appears to be the same scale as the person. Boss enemies very commonly are larger than everything else. This creates an intimidation factor, of course. Other things are scaled. Sometimes you'll have a game where you go into an area and it's actually larger on the inside than it is on the outside. This is sometimes players ignore it, but it's kind of a mistake. If it's a really large place, you should make a really large place on the outside, and the same on the outside as the inside. You don't have to. Maybe it fits into your game. Maybe you're making a Doctor Who game, but generally, spaces of things, in order for humans to want to play them correctly, they should work out pretty well. And if they don't, maybe there's a reason for it that's story related or mechanics related in your game. All right, and that's all the slides I have for you. We'll go back. Keep an eye on Blackboard. Not sure when we're coming back to classes. or if we're coming back to classes. So keep an eye on Blackboard. The quiz for this week is open Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So Monday starting at 6 a.m. to Wednesday at midnight. Last week the quiz had the date set wrong, so it was not open at its correct time. I've reopened it again for this week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, same time. So you have 2 quizzes between Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Don't forget the discussion board. I believe the times are all correct on those. I will be double checking. You have the full week to do those. Try to do your first post on Monday so that other people have a chance to comment on yours and you have a chance to comment on theirs. For the rest of the week, there's not going to be any change with the discussion posting. If you have any other questions about any of the assignments, feel free to send me an email. You can post a question on the general discussion board. If I don't see it right away, maybe somebody else already has the answer for you. I do encourage you to work together in the general discussion board if you can. I have not graded or even looked at your midterm projects yet. The couple more weeks we'll have more information for the final project. I know I should be grading the midterms between now and over spring break. Have a great spring break if you can. I don't know if you had any plans. I'm sure they're canceled. Stay home or whatever. You know, see these folks on the news. Don't go crazy. But try and enjoy yourself if you can. And so that's that. That's today. Do the quiz, the discussion board. Last week's quiz is available. I will try to make sure that all the rest of them for the semester are available Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and not just the 3 hours that we were in class like we were before. All right, you guys have a good day.